But that's if you're sitting about doing not very much. If you're actually out, looking for calories, then you may spend as much as 3,000 calories or even more in cold climes. So there's an energy cost to actually collecting the energy.
Welcome to Activist MMT, a podcast about real-world economics, including modern money theory, and how life changes when you discover it. I'm your host, Jeff Epstein. Today's part 2 of my 2-part conversation with Derek Ross. Derek's a Nova Scotia resident who's been a chorus member in theatrical productions for 4 decades in shows such as The Pirates of Penzance by Gilbert and Sullivan. He and his wife also run a bed and breakfast. In part 1, we spent the first half talking about the non-economic topics of music and musical theater, and solar panels and electric cars. Today, we continue our conversation on the basics of Georgism and its relationship to MMT. And now, back to my conversation with Derek Ross. Enjoy. Representative of many of our problems that, people don't pull out and see the larger picture. Climate change, perfect example. We can just keep doing what we're doing, but you don't pull back and see the larger picture that's going on.
No, I agree with that. I think that's quite a reasonable way of looking at it. I think in some ways, Georgism is a lens as well. In some ways, I'm saying Georgism, but I mean, basically it's classical economics. It's a different way of looking at things. And the big difference between the classical economics of Henry George and our modern economics is that natural resources were built into the 19th century view of economics. When we say land, we're not just talking about the ground you stand on. We're talking about the light, the air, basically the entire universe. What we would nowadays call natural capital or natural resources.
And even the frequency like internet, frequency like
right.
I don't know the terminology for it, but basically, you're allowed to use this bandwidth for television, for internet or whatever.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and that's a perfect example of the sort of thing that Georges would consider to be land, although it's not what you would normally mean by the term when you're using it in everyday conversation. Mm-hmm. It's basically about the natural resources. I agree with what you're saying about the fact that it's too narrow. I think it's a focus because in many ways, as I say, you can expand the Georgist idea to include the government by basically saying the government is the prime landlord. And actually, if you look back to 1066 and sort of the Norman conquest of England or whatever, that very much was the case. I mean, King William I saw himself as the landlord of the country, and there was a hierarchy going down from him, which made that very clear. Landlords and sub-landlords, all the way down to the poor old peasant who was actually growing the potatoes or whatever. In some ways, it's a question of how you look at it. But I do think that, as I say, Georgism did not explain money very well. MMT does. And that's why I think there's a real place for synthesis there. I know that Warren Mosler certainly, although he's not a Georgist himself, certainly the tax he normally talks about, the real estate tax. And most Georgists would be happy to see that as a good tax. Maybe not a perfect one, but certainly a better one than most of the taxes we have in place just now. Not so much because of the funding the government thing, but because there are certain behaviours that we need to, get happening. We need to be able to provision the government. We need to stop people using high carbon fuels, that sort of thing. And there are taxes on natural resources which will persuade people to behave differently from what they're doing just now.
Is MMT missing anything, or does Georgism basically just fit within that pretty neatly?
Well, I think it fits within. I mean, I think that MMT, it's not so much that it's missing something, but I don't think it focuses enough on what happens within the private sector. I don't think that's to say it can't. I really like the sectoral balance analysis part of MMT, just because it does allow us to break down the economy into different groups and, see how they interact from both a monetary point of view and a resources point of view. I mean, normally sectoral balance analysis is used to show how money flows between, different parts of the economy. But the good thing about it is it doesn't just have to show how money and debt operates. It can show how any commodity behaves. If we want to see, how water, for instance, is handled within the economy, you can break it up into, again, the owners of water resources, the water issuers, so to speak, and the water users, the rest of us, and just see how that operates. Sectoral balance analysis is actually quite an important, significant tool. It could be used for a lot more than it actually is at the moment. And that's one place where I think we do need to get a bit more work done in MMT, is on just the interchange, the exchange between resources and money that goes on. I think that's still not clearly understood, just how MMT actually does suggest that prices are set in the real world. It's all very well saying that the government spends money and taxes it back. Well, that's great. That's fine. That's true. When we are talking about inflation or about the prices of things, I think it's important just to remember that really the base prices for a lot of stuff really are set the way Warren Mosler says. It really is a question of the government sets the base price. Now, if it's an item that's in short supply, it may well be that the actual price is higher than the government would want. But the fact is, if the government decides not to pay for something any more than a set price, the lack of money that will eventually arise means that the price won't stray too far from what the government wants to pay. And that's particularly true with labour. It's maybe less true with some other things where there's a big private sector demand for consumption. Yeah, I think that's one area where a bit more research should happen. Again, I think that in energy terms, that's particularly true. We have, the US government as sole supplier of the US dollar. But when we look in the other side for the resources, they're not the sole supplier of the oil supply, So, if you want to deal with dollars, the price of the dollar in oil is going to be set by what the US government's prepared to pay for oil. But the price of oil generally is going to be set by what the Saudis or the other big producers agree to accept as the price. And I think that's been quite obvious, right now actually, with the differential pricing that's set by the Saudis for Europe and for North America and South America and whatnot.
That was basically the cause of the OPEC oil crisis. OPEC decided to raise their prices. And actually, kind of an aside, but kind of not, is the real causes of inflation, as I understand it, and I'm sure that there's more, but I think what I'm saying is, what I'm about to say is right, that it's caused by catastrophe, it's caused by bad politics, and it's caused by market power. And market power is really an extension of bad policy, of allowing the market to have that much power. So the OPEC oil crisis was caused by OPEC choosing to raise their prices in revenge against the United States supporting Israel. And combined with the bad policy of making way too much of our economy dependent on that one product and leaving us vulnerable in that way.
Yeah. No, I'd agree with that, Jeff. In fact, I'd take it one stage further and say it's no coincidence that the OPEC crisis happened shortly after the U.S. domestic production of oil dropped far enough that they were no longer able to export it.
Really? Okay. It's the first I'm hearing that.
Yeah. Well, if you look into the sort of the oil production in the U.S., you'll find that the oil imports, well, basically up until the end of the 60s, the U.S. was basically self-sufficient in oil. That's not to say that it didn't export and import it, but the fact was that it exported more than it imported. But yeah, from the beginning of the 70s onwards, it started having to import oil because energy requirements or desires kept on increasing, and domestic production could not keep up.
So domestic production didn't decrease. We just stopped sending. We started using more of it. I think that's what you're saying.
Well, yeah, it is basically. It's a combination. Basically, there was peak oil production in the U.S. basically in the late 60s, early 70s, something. I'm not sure the exact date. I need to have a look at the graph. But it became cheaper to buy Saudi oil because the production costs were lower. Demand kept increasing. The production within the US did not. In fact, it didn't really recover until fairly recently when they developed the fracking process, which has produced quite a lot of cheap oil or cheaper oil, relatively recently, and put the US back into a good position. The drawback is it's not.
Yeah, as long as you don't just pull back, as long as you don't pull back and see the devastation that has wrought in other ways.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Not going to argue with that one. But I'm looking on it purely in terms of
sure, of course.
The profit. That's the thing. And from that point of view, which is the way that most of the money people do look at it, and then it became a good thing for them, which has led to the relative weakness of OPEC more recently. But the fact is that fracking has achieved its purpose, but it's not quite so effective as just large quantities of cheap oil. You need to put quite a lot of energy in to get energy out, so to speak. Wasting water and poisoning the water and all that stuff. All that stuff, yeah. All those stuff. Yeah. But you see, those things don't necessarily cost, particularly if there's no enforceable regulations. Cost in money terms, and that's all that shareholders are interested in.
Sure.
I mean, the thing is, it's a bit unfair to shareholders because it's not just shareholders. We all have benefited from it. So from that point of view, we're all to blame to some extent. But the fact is that unless you really do know how it works, you can be forgiven for going, it'll be okay. But I don't know. I think with the amount of evidence that's building up for climate change at the moment, there are fewer and fewer people who are, not persuaded that we need to do something, fairly soon, if not now.
If not 20 years ago.
Not 20 years ago, yeah. No, you're right. But anyway, I'm just looking again at the incentives, at the monetary incentives to do.
Sure, of course. Yeah.
From that point of view, yeah, it made sense from a monetary incentives point of view.
Sure.
And it's why I think that OPEC, it may have lost the whip hand for 20 years, but if we carry on and do nothing, I mean, forget about the environmental damage. The fact is that it will allow them to basically take charge again, quite strongly. But anyway, that's all dependent on policy, and who knows whether policy will change for the better or not.
Right. So MMT basically is a framework in which Georgism can sit very neatly. That seems to be correct. Yeah. And actually, I spoke with someone a year ago who said that he's from Pakistan, and he discovered MMT and whatever, and he's also, this is really rough, but he kind of considers MMT and Islamic economics, they're two separate things, but they're both very important to him. And again, MMT is a framework that enhances Islamic economics. So MMT enhances or facilitates or whatever Georgism as well, where neoclassical economics really makes those things impossible. I mean, I'm not sure about Georgism, but at least with Islamic economics and even just the ability to pull back and see the bigger picture, MMT allows that. It not just allows it encourages it. It requires it for you to pull back and see the larger picture. And there really is no picture larger than that, really. It really covers, everything. I mean, in a sense, because, I think John Harvey's work on exchange rate determination and Fadl's work on developing countries, I think those three things together, what's bigger than that? What's bigger than that? Setting aside the universe off of our planet, that really covers everything, I think. So everything that is compatible with that bigger picture should fit rather well into that, I think. So Georgism and Islamic economics and, truly dealing with a climate crisis and whatever else. I don't know.
But I think that's why, Michael Hudson's stuff fits in so well, with the MMT, why he was able to, join the group, so to speak. Because, he's an anti-Georgist from the point of view that he doesn't like a lot of Georgists. But if you look at what he actually understands, it basically is Georgism. Just, I know that as a younger man, he was involved with a lot of quite right-wing people who were part of the Georgist movement. But I think that's soured a lot on it. And it's true. I mean, again, like MMT, well, maybe not quite like MMT, but Georgism does actually attract people from all over the political spectrum because it's one of these, like MMT, it is orthogonal necessarily to the policies. It provides a lens of understanding. The policies that you actually implement as a result of that understanding depend on other beliefs that you may have, I remember quite a few years now, I used to, troll various groups by putting up different versions of MMT, depending on whether you were, an environmentalist or a fascist or a left-winger or whatever. Because it is possible to do it. I mean, they look at, the basics of an MMT policy are that you have a job guarantee of some sort, so that you spend money that way to do the inflation control. And you can basically, set up most political persuasions so that they have some way of getting money out, whether everybody joins the army or, whether it's everybody plants trees type of thing. But, it's probably possible to make that work. Yeah, MMT is very wide. It does really include everything. Maybe not in quite as much detail as it might, but the good side of that is it means that a lot of people can pick up the ideas and go, oh yeah, that fits in with what I already believe,
It has unfinished business, but what is there is solid.
Yeah, solid. No, I think so. Yeah. I think so.
I think that's obviously somewhat of a function that it's rather young, relatively speaking, 25 years old, and obviously not that huge of a population of academics anyway. Okay. All right. Well, I'm not sure regarding, if there's anything as far as you want to finish regarding MMT and Georgism, how you discovered it, if there's anything more recently, and when that ends, then we can move on to the specific reading if you'd like.
No, that's fine. I mean, as I say, I think that it's given me a good understanding of how economics works generally. Both Georgism originally and MMT more latterly. So I feel pretty happy actually with my current understanding of economics. I mean, I think when I think myself about ways forward, because as I say, I'm always trying to find something more, so a better explanation of what we got, and then I still think hard about the inflation side of it. It's not just about the inflation, but it's about like the price level. And for instance, things like a job guarantee is a great system. What do you set the basic wage for in it? And why is it we have to set it to this amount rather than that amount? I mean, we're not going to pay everybody, like $1,000 a week. You can set it to be a very small amount or a very large amount. And if it's a very small amount, then people are going to starve. And if it's a very large amount, you're going to get huge inflation. Okay, so I mean, there is a best amount, so to speak, to set it to. Because whatever amount you do set it to, then prices will adjust until eventually, that the dollar is worth enough that even if you're only paying them 10 cents an hour, it's going to work out that 10 cents is actually quite a valuable. A cent is worth quite a lot. But the drawback is that the pain and suffering involved before you actually reach that stage would obviously be horrendous. So I think there's work still to be done, on that side, which is where the energy stuff that I mentioned to you really comes in, and where I don't think that either Georgism or MMT really, have a full explanation of yet. I think there is more to be said. And that's why, I have been looking into the role of energy. In many ways, you can look on human beings as having an ecology as well as an economy. It's like we've got to be able to survive in our particular niche or society or whatever. And we have to do that partly by meeting the energy requirements or the food requirements or the water requirements for living. And partly we have to meet the social requirements. We need to pay others what we owe them when we said we would pay them. We've got to decide when doing something means we owe somebody else and when doing something means no change in the status quo. And as I say, I think that's where the energy side that I talked about earlier in the week comes into things. The fact is, when you look at human activity, energy is probably actually the most important part of it. You can see that if you basically just look at food. Food is basically concentrated sunlight. It's chemical energy that's been collected in the first instance by plants from the sun. Then it's either eaten directly by us or is collected and eaten by cows or sheep or pigs or whatever, and again ends up as chemical energy and food for us. And if you look at it from that point of view, then we all need, I think, somewhere about 1,800 kilocalories a day or 9 megajoules, of what is basically pure energy that has to be collected. But collecting it in itself takes energy, Even if you're a hunter-gatherer and you're going out, you may well only require 1,800 calories, but that's if you're sitting about doing not very much. If you're actually out, looking for calories, then you may spend as much as 3,000 calories or even more in cold climes. So there's an energy cost to actually collecting the energy. And that's true not just for energy itself, but also, for things like water, which we absolutely need. But you've got to spend energy in going out and collecting that. Even the gold that everybody loves for coinage, or all the gold bugs do anyway, the reason that gold is expensive is because you need to use a lot of energy to collect it, It involves crushing up a whole lot of rocks, and it's not cheap doing that, whether you've got men with hammers or whether you've got really expensive machinery to do it. Either way, you're either paying for the food energy to feed people, or you're paying for the fossil fuel energy or whatever it happens to be to run the machines. So energy is important to the ecology, certainly, of how things work. And so hunter-gatherers basically spend a lot of time just collecting food. Gold miners spend a lot of energy collecting gold. And the price of anything just about can be at the base to be either the cost of collecting. It is basically the cost of collecting the energy.
Food and gold are very different in the sense that food is immediately, quickly consumed and goes away.
Yeah. Yes.
And gold needs to be stored and protected for all time.
Yes, it does. But the fact is, once it's been stored, it's been taken out of the hole of the ground and put back into a hole in the ground, it's as if it wasn't there anymore. It's exactly the same with money for currency users. I mean, I know that, for a currency issuer, the money can be produced in any quantities required. But for us poor old currency users, it's a bit trickier. We either need to collect existing money, or we need to get a loan, which is basically the creation of new money by some other person. That works for money, but it doesn't really work for real resources. We can owe real resources, but we can only really collect them from other people or collect them from the universe as a whole. The fact is that because of that, they have a real value because we need to spend energy to collect them. That's the point.
Okay.
And it doesn't matter really what the thing is. Even something like Bitcoin, where it's been set basically to be very similar in the way it operates to gold. With the limit on the total number of Bitcoins that can be produced and whatnot.
Bitcoin is an artificial scarcity.
Absolutely, it is. Yeah, absolutely. But then so is any form of money. I mean, the reason that, the dollar is scarce, and there's a lot of people who say that they can't get dollars, is because, the government produces them, and it's not producing as many as are necessarily required to pay the taxes, In a country which is running a government surplus, there is absolutely a scarcity of money because the government is producing less money than it is asking for in taxes.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, absolutely, it's an artificial scarcity. That's a very good way of putting it. But yeah, what the point I was going to make about Bitcoin was, why is Bitcoin currently worth $10,000 or whatever it is?
Because they wanted to be worth that much. That's why.
It's because it costs that much to make a new Bitcoin. Currently the algorithm is set so that you need to spend that amount in electricity bills basically to get a new Bitcoin, and therefore a Bitcoin miner, if he's already, if he's just spent $9,990 in creating a new Bitcoin, is he really going to give it to you for less than $10,000? Not really, So it's a very basic part of the cost of anything, not just in money, but just part of the physical cost is the energy cost of doing things.
I have a couple questions.
Yep.
That doesn't seem right to me. That if you're saying that the cost to mine a Bitcoin is $10,000 and that's why it costs $10,000 because of the cost to mine it, then how does that explain the massive fluctuations that it has? It's not because the miners decide that it's worth suddenly 20% less 2 hours later.
Yeah. No, I understand that. Nobody's actually deciding what the cost is. What's happening is that there's a certain amount of new Bitcoin being created, and those new Bitcoin they cost whatever the cost of electricity is to create them. And currently it's somewhere around $10,000, whatever it is. But there's also a whole bunch of existing Bitcoin. And like you say, in a sense, it's an artificial scarcity. If nobody is selling Bitcoins, because they're all expecting it to go up, but everybody wants, but a whole lot of people want to buy Bitcoins, then their only choice is to buy from the miners. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
However, people sell Bitcoins, existing Bitcoins, as well as buying them because they want to cash out. They want the dollars. And when they sell those off, those Bitcoins are already manufactured, so there's no cost to transferring them from one owner to another.
Sure.
So if enough of them go out in the market, that's when the price of Bitcoin collapses, because who's going to bother creating a new one, which costs $10,000, when you can buy a second-hand one, which is just as good and, only costs $8,000 or $5,000,
Right. So I think the causation is the other way around. The price is determined by group psychology. And
yes.
So if the group psychology has decided on a price that is approximately the cost of the computer equipment required to mine another one, then that is how miners decide whether or not to mine more.
Yes.
So the miners don't decide on the price, but they choose to mine or not mine based on the market price, which at the moment happens to be worth their while.
Yes. No, I agree. That is what they do. Yeah. And it is psychology, because the fact is, if nobody wanted Bitcoin, it would have no value. The reason it has value is because people want it. Yeah.
Right. I got interested in Bitcoin when Elon Musk tweeted in, I think it was May, and saying, "Oh, I don't like Bitcoin anymore," and that he decided to tell the world this instead of just making this decision privately for himself. He decided to tell the world about this, which caused the price of Bitcoin to plummet 20% in 2 hours, which cost the entire worldwide value of Bitcoin and their millions of holders to lose $170 billion.
Yeah.
So, so it's like, okay, so a single tweet by a single billionaire can cause that much devastation. That kind of shows what it is based on. And then a country decides, oh, let's make this our currency for all 7 million of our people.
Yeah.
Let's make all of our 7 million people vulnerable to Elon Musk's tweets.
It's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah. So I have another question. Going back to what you were talking about, food, energy to get food. That you need food to have energy, but you need energy to get food. And can you talk about capitalism a little bit? Meaning, capitalism gets way more food than we can possibly ever consume. I mean, that's maybe a little bit of exaggeration, but that's in the right ballpark. Capitalism is wasteful. It gets too much. We don't need it. And food, good kinds of food, or a good amount of good kinds of food goes bad. So that's even more energy wasted. And create a bulk store, which we call BJ's or Sam's Club down here, a bulk store of an obscene amount of food that, just the amount of energy that it costs to the balance of energy, basically. I can't really get my mind around the idea, but I think
I understand what you're getting at, though. What I would say here is that the problem with capitalism as it currently is, capitalism isn't totally bad.
And actually, let me interject one last thing before you continue, and that is deliberate waste. So like Whole Foods, they only want perfect-looking strawberries. So they dump, and I don't know if this is specifically true, but it's certainly generally true. They dump out the bad ones even before there's a chance of selling them. When restaurants close, they'll dump the food, or Wawa will dump their excess food instead of giving it to people who desperately need that food. So please.
Okay. Right. What I would say here is that the issue is, it's twofold. Basically, the idea of capitalism, I still think the best way of looking at it is the idea of, with capitalism, you use money to buy something which you can then use to make more money than you originally spent to buy the stuff. That's basically what it comes down to. The problem with it, I think, in the current world is that the money unit we're using is not tied into the real world as well as it could be. The money basically is what's being collected. If we talked about energy or about hours worked, then the waste would be a lot more obvious. Okay? It's not obvious at the moment because the people who are collecting the money, the capitalists or the rentiers at the top, are not the initial collectors. They're collecting from people who are also collecting. So, again, I'm encouraged to go back to simpler example with food, not because it only applies to food, but just as generally speaking, it's easier to think about it that way. But basically, you can think of two groups of people in a hunter-gatherer society. Okay, you've got the people who are out collecting the food, and perhaps you have the people who are sitting at home because they're elderly or because they're children, I suppose, who can't collect the food but still need to eat. That works well in hunter-gatherer societies because people are basically, on the same level. Where it starts working more like the way we work is when you start getting people who can force the others to do the collection while they just eat, so to speak. The king with the armies who can basically say, "Feed me and my soldiers," otherwise we'll come and lock you up, or we won't allow you to use the good hunting land, that sort of thing. One of the big advantages of farming was it allowed us to feed a lot more people with a lot less work, a lot less energy involved. One of the drawbacks, it meant that the person who actually owned the farmland would now basically sit down and go, well, you don't get to use the land unless you give me this much as a rent. And that's basically the problem with capitalism as a whole. When you're talking about Whole Foods and so forth there, the Whole Foods people aren't growing the apples. They're just going, well, I want to collect them, but I only want to collect so many because if I try and sell too many, I won't be able to get a good price. And I don't want these ones because I don't care how much energy you spent in growing them. I didn't spend any energy in growing them,
Mm-hmm.
So the hierarchy thing that we saw in feudalism, it's still there in modern capitalism. It's just not quite so obvious,
It's dispersed, it's diffused. It's so evenly spread that it's very hard to point at any one thing.
Much harder, yes, it is. But it's still there, and that's why, like Michael Hudson, I still think about rentiers, as being a major problem in society. I mean, they don't tend to own, large sort of feudal domains of land anymore, but they do own, sort of banks and this sort of thing. They do own things which are in short supply, but which are essential, and they do take advantage. The drawback, as you say, is that because of that, we do get more waste than we otherwise should, because the people who are doing the work are not the same as the people who are distributing, and they have different agendas, and they don't care about the amount of energy that's already been spent, because that's all sunk cost for somebody else, So that is an issue with the capitalism. It could to a large extent, well, it could to some extent be fixed, if we did change to an energy accounting system instead of a money accounting system. But the fact is, it's, as I say, it's not just ecology, it's economy. And we have these social relationships. There are certain people, who, because they have a lot of power, because everybody owes them, or they own the natural resources, or whatever it happens to be, the patents to Windows, or whatever. They have a lot of power and they use it as they see fit, which isn't necessarily always to the benefit of the rest of us,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I do think that the MMT policy, the job guarantee, would fix quite a lot of problems. I don't think it would fix all the problems, though. Basically, we have other policies that would need to be put into effect to curb the overlarge power of a lot of people. I think that to a large extent that was done, after the Second World War. The implementation of Keynes' ideas during the 50s and 60s. Again, but there's other social problems of the eras. Monetarily speaking, it actually really did work quite well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we can do away with capitalism entirely, and even if we do, then what do you replace it with? That's the point. We can't go back to all being hunter-gatherers because the world isn't big enough for that to happen. It's not a great life. We've tried the socialist experiment again in the Eastern Europe and Russia, and it worked, but it didn't work great. The same sort of problems come up. It's just that instead of the rentiers being aristocrats and feudal lords, they turn into being bureaucrats and feudal lords.
I kind of reject the whole idea of should we choose capitalism or should we choose socialism or communism. Like this idea of these simplistic labels. Whatever the case, big changes are coming. Whatever we want to call it or not call it really doesn't matter. I mean, I think instead of should we get rid of capitalism, and I know that I'm sure that we're generally on the same page. I'm just like, should we get rid of capitalism and what do we replace it with? It's like, what's the point of even talking about that, really? We just need to give people health care. We need to give people a job, and we need to, prevent, we need to stop using fossil fuels and start having the conversations of what that means, which is a pretty big conversation to have. It doesn't matter if we stick with capitalism or try and go to socialism or whatever. These problems don't change. So let's just focus on the problems and see what happens, and let's take it from there. I know that I'm sure that in general that we're almost entirely in agreement. It's just.
No, and I think we are, absolutely. I mean, I think the important thing is what works. Be pragmatic. I mean, in many ways, we had a much more mixed economy in the 60s and 70s, and by and large, it worked. I mean, it's not perfect, nothing is, but that's the important measure. Whether it's socialist or capitalist or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, Keynesianism basically just gave people what they needed.
Yep.
I mean, it's just basically the golden age of capitalism basically just gave people what they needed. Maybe it was too much. Maybe we, went overboard, but life was much better because everybody, most people, got what they needed. And that, regardless, it happened to work under a capitalist system just because that's what we happen to be. But, okay, so we did not get to your reading. So if there's anything you wanted to say regarding that, I mean, I guess a lot of it was kind of covered along the way. But if you wanted to mention the book,
Good.
And yeah, why don't you go ahead and do that?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it makes sense. I was actually quite surprised when, you asked me about sources. I had a look around to see, just what there was, because, to a large extent, I've picked up as bits and pieces, over the years, so I didn't really have a single source. But, yeah, if you start looking into energy economics on the web, there's quite a bit of published academic stuff about it. Some of it's more MMT aligned and some of it's less MMT aligned, just depending when it's written. But the ideas are there, and it's you can pick the good out of the bad, so to speak, and say, well, that would might make sense. But it's one of these. If you are also looking at it as an energy thing, then you can also bring into the the mix the fact that the government is spending so much on manufactured goods, because the manufacturing goods takes energy, or just plain on energy itself, because all these machines need to be fueled before they work, and that's why, we don't want to say the job guarantee is the only thing that's required to set the price level. Because, you can set the level of job guarantee fine, and then if suddenly climate change or, eventually climate change has caused the potato to stop being a food item, or, has said, a disease has devastated the maize harvest, it doesn't matter, what price level the government set for the wages, because people are still going to starve,
if there's no food, it doesn't matter how much money we have. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
If there's no resources, then,
Yeah, and that's why I think, you must take the real resources are really important. You've got to take them into account when you're looking at it. Yeah, MMT, absolutely. I love the fact that it does talk about the shortages of things, that the resources are the important driver with inflation, not the amount of money, but the amount of debt and the amount of resource that you can buy. Yeah, absolutely. I'm all with the fact that if you look at the Zimbabwe inflation or the Weimar inflation, or even the current Venezuelan inflation, it's all down to the fact that people are short of essentials, and when they're short of essentials, then it doesn't matter whether you've got a job guarantee in place or not. The fact is that things are going to go up in price once people start to starve.
Oh, on that note. Okay. Well, is there anything else that you would like to say that hasn't been said?
No, I'm fine, Jeff. I've enjoyed the conversation, or you allowing me to rabbit on anyway. Okay. All
right. Well, thank you for doing this, and especially thank you you were incredibly supportive through my presentation. You gave me so much valuable feedback regarding my presentation early this year, and I think even a previous experience as well, which I don't recall specifically, but I feel like that we had kind of done that before as well. That was really invaluable. I'm in a way, it never came together. It really never came together, and I'm very disappointed about that. Like, it was just too intense. Like, I could never boil it down. But that's the bad side of it. But the good side of it is it was really, I got a lot. I still got a lot out of the experience. I learned a lot, and I came up with some really, really valuable analogies that I still use. So yeah, you were very supportive with that.
It's just for your as you say, your personal sort of understanding. I'm glad that I was able to help. That's great. Well, I have to say, I know how much time and effort and whatever I've spent over the years trying to get to the bottom of all this stuff. Still am to some extent, and I just wish that some of this stuff had come out when I was in my 20s or 30s, because I would have taken a different approach probably to investing than I did. Because one of the areas where I do find it very useful is looking at trends. You're not going to say day to day what's happening in the stock market. But I look at the way that the deficits and whatnot are running in the US and Canada and in Europe. And I go, I know where I want to put my money. So it is important. You don't tend to worry so much about investments when you are your age or younger, just because you've got so much else going on in your life. But it's something you got to keep a handle on, because eventually it will become important.
All right. Well, thank you so much for doing this. It was really nice talking with you. We see each other a lot on intro, and we talk in private messages, and I look forward to more of that. But thank you for taking the time to do this. It was great.
Yeah, always a pleasure, Jeff. Thanks very much for inviting me, and I hope some of what was said is useful anyway. That's good. Well, have a good day then, and we'll speak to you later.
Music for this show is by RecTech. You can find RecTech on SoundCloud and Spotify at WRECK_TECH. To record Activist MMT, I use the iOS phone app Tape-A-Call Plus for recording phone calls and Zencaster for internet-based recordings. My post-production workflow starts by editing on the iOS app AnyTune Pro Plus, then transferring those timestamps to my Windows desktop. At that point, I crudely process the audio in Audacity and then implement the edits and do all of the final processing in the Reaper digital audio workstation. Activist MMT is hosted by Libsyn, and the video teasers are created with the online Headliner app. Today's part 2 of my 2-part conversation with Derek Ross. Derek's a Nova Scotia resident who's been a chorus member in theatrical productions for 4 decades in shows such as The Pirates of Penzance by Gilbert and Sullivan. He and his wife also run a bed and breakfast. In part 1, we spent the first half talking about the non-economic topics of music and musical theater, and solar panels and electric cars. Today, we continue our conversation on the basics of Georgism and its relationship to MMT. And now, back to my conversation with Derek Ross. Enjoy.